Beneath the marble heart of Rome, where the stones breathe with centuries and corridors spiral into silence, there lies a labyrinth that very few have entered. Some call it the Vatican's secret archive. Others imagine it as a place where questions are buried deeper than the dead. Within its drawers are whispers of letters rewritten, parchments pardoning knights even as flames consumed them, maps of cities never built, and sketches where even Michelangelo left eyes blank, as though afraid to see what he had drawn. There are vows that liken men to corpses, words never sent by popes, and pages erased so completely that absence itself becomes the secret. What if these fragments are not separate stories, but part of one long breath, an echo that has endured across centuries? What if the truth, fragile yet unbroken, lingers not in answers, but in silence? This is Serene Myths, where history is told in whispers and shadows, slow enough to fall asleep to, steady enough to linger in the mind. If you wish, you can like this video, subscribe to the channel for more journeys through myth and memory, and share in the comments the time on the clock where you've joined us tonight. And now, let us step quietly into the first chamber, where a column of cold air rises through stone, as if the earth itself were exhaling a secret it cannot hold. The stone corridor descended in a long spiral, colder with each turn, the sound of footsteps folding into the hush of air that had waited centuries without interruption. A torch flame trembled against the damp wall, throwing uneven shadows that seemed to pulse like silent hearts. The first chamber, they said, was never meant to be entered, for here the stones carried a breath of their own. In the centre of the circular vault, a column of cold air rose, as if the earth exhaled through some hidden lung. Scholars argued over geology, over forgotten vents from the catacombs, but no theory fully explained how the draft remained steady across seasons, like a secret spine holding the archive in its icy grasp. Once, a guard named Father Angelo paused at this very threshold. He had the duty of sealing doors, of counting locks and extinguishing lamps. But when he passed the vault, he whispered, "The church buries questions, not the dead." His words drifted into legend, written in the margins of notes found decades later by another custodian. Those who walked near the chamber often felt their candles gutter, though there was no gust, no rush of air, just the same column rising, invisible, but undeniable. Some said the draft preserved the parchment within, slowing decay like the breath of eternity. Others feared it was the mark of restless spirits. Between explanation and unease, the truth lingered in silence, heavy but unresolved. The circle of the vault had no cross, no altar, no sign of worship. Instead, it felt unfinished, as if designed for another purpose and abandoned before consecration. An inventory sheet dated to the 17th century mentioned "room of peculiar draught," but offered no function, no reason for its inclusion in the catalogue. Later keepers noted the stone blocks there carried hairline cracks that formed almost geometric arcs, like ribs of a greater design. Was it architecture meant to amplify resonance, or simply flaws of quarry stone settling in darkness? No mason's record survived to answer. The absence itself became louder than any inscription. You can almost feel the chill sliding over your arms, like water flowing upstream. The air clings, yet never dampens, never leaves droplets on the skin. It is the sensation of standing where time has paused, of being watched not by eyes, but by the stones themselves. If one closes their eyes, the hum of silence beats softly against the ears, steady as a heart that does not belong to you. Legends multiplied in the taverns near the Vatican walls. A scribe once whispered that prisoners were lowered into the vault centuries ago, left to freeze though no ice was visible. Another insisted that buried beneath the flagstones lay a second chamber, smaller, filled with sealed jars. He claimed a mason's apprentice broke one by accident, and the column of cold was born from that rupture. forever leaking some unseen essence. Yet no excavation has been permitted, no stones lifted. The chamber stands untouched, guarded more by taboo than by locks. An unusual object was once reported by a visiting archivist, a mirror leaning against the far wall. The glass, however, reflected nothing of those who passed before it, only the wavering torchlight. Whether it was a trick of tarnished silver or an invention of gossip, the report was copied into a letter now stored in a separate folder. Its authenticity remains debated. The Vatican denies such a mirror ever existed, though the page describing it bears the signature of a known custodian. Between denial and testimony lies the uncertain ground where history often resides. Even the most skeptical visitors remarked on the stillness. In a city alive with bells and footsteps, this one circle seemed suspended outside sound. When a bell tolled above in St. Peter's Square, the resonance entered late, as if the chamber heard time differently, delayed by unseen layers. Some said the cold air column was not merely draft, but a silent metronome, measuring eternity at its own pace. The presence of such a place inside the apostolic archive sets the tone for what follows. It is not merely a vault of documents, but a labyrinth of atmospheres, each room with its own weight. Some safeguard knowledge, some guard absence, and a few seem to guard questions more than answers. This first chamber, half fact, half rumour, remains the silent preface to every other secret. And so the story begins with uncertainty woven into stone, with an echo of Angelo's words still carried by the column of air. Questions buried deeper than the dead. The torches gutter once more, shadows lengthen, and the spiral continues downward. Ahead lies another door, one that bears no lock yet refuses to open, waiting with its own riddle in the cold. The steps of the custodian had grown slow with age, though his memory remained sharper than the keys he carried. He was known only as the keeper, the man who walked nightly rounds through the deepest halls of the archive. In his pocket, he kept a ledger of doors opened and sealed, a ritual of ink and tally marks. Yet the story that clung to him was not about his duties, but about one night when he opened the wrong door. He claimed he did not seek it. The corridor simply bent differently, guiding him to a frame of wood darker than any other, its arch carved with a tilted cross, neither upright nor fallen, but leaning, as if caught between faith and collapse. The custodian pushed it open and found a room small, lined not with shelves of parchment, but with silence so heavy it made his breath stumble. On a pedestal stood a wooden box bound by iron clasps. Its surface bore scratches that looked like runes, though no scholar later could decipher them. He reached out, and his hand trembled as the iron felt warmer than the air, as though blood rather than rust coursed through the seams. Atop the box leaned a mirror no larger than a palm, its silver surface dulled to smoke. When he glanced into it, no reflection met him. His own face was gone, replaced only by the flicker of torch flame, which bent into shapes like wings before fading. He confessed years later that the mirror unsettled him more than the box. A man can choose not to open a container, but a mirror refuses choice. It confronts you the moment you look. Without reflection, he wondered if he still stood in the room, or if the room had erased him. His notes described the sensation of being outside himself, as though history had swallowed him whole for a moment, leaving only the ledger behind. On the floor beneath the pedestal lay a single sheet of parchment, dustless, though the rest of the chamber was thick with it. The sheet bore a motto in faded ink: Veritas non timet tempus. Truth does not fear time. Strangely, the letters appeared too sharp for their supposed age, as if someone had inked them anew not long before. And yet the handwriting matched samples from the 16th century, a hand that should have been long still. The custodian did not tell his superiors immediately. For years, the story survived only in whispers between clerks. Then, during a renovation, a different guard reported seeing the same box, but claimed the mirror was absent. Another insisted there was no pedestal at all, only the parchment alone. Each testimony conflicted, and so the chamber became less a fact than a riddle, a place where memory itself fractured. Some argued that the keeper, in his long solitude, had dreamed it. Others suspected that rooms in the archive were designed to confuse, to bend space and trick the mind. A labyrinth built not only of stone, but of perception. You step closer in imagination. Feel the uneven stone floor beneath your feet. The air grows close, warmer here than the column chamber, heavy as though breath itself thickened into a veil. The wooden box waits, its clasps shut, and the absence of your own reflection gnaws at the edges of sight. You blink, but still the mirror yields only flame. It is not darkness that unsettles, but the erasure of presence. The strange cross carved into the doorframe sparked much debate. Some claimed it was a mason's mistake, a misaligned design corrected in later halls. Yet its tilt seemed deliberate, balanced precariously, neither submission nor defiance. Medieval marginalia often drew slanted crosses to signal doubt, but no record exists of one carved at such a scale into a structural frame. Did a craftsman leave his own secret opinion hidden within sacred stone? Or was the door itself once used in a ritual that blurred the line between blessing and curse? The phrase veritas non timet tempus has been cited elsewhere in church writings, often in contexts defending doctrine. But here, stripped of commentary, it felt less like a slogan and more like a warning. If truth does not fear time, perhaps time fears truth. And thus the archive's duty was not to protect the faithful from lies, but to protect the hierarchy from truths too enduring to control. The motto, anonymous yet familiar, hung in the air like incense, too thick to breathe. Late in his life, the custodian wrote a private memoir, pages of which survive in fragmentary copies. In one passage, he admitted, "I left the box unopened, for I feared its silence more than any sound. And I left the mirror behind, though in every glass since I see not myself, but the flame bending into wings." That final line has been cited as proof of hallucination, perhaps the erosion of an old man's mind. Still, archivists note that the handwriting remains steady, the ink strong, suggesting clarity even in frailty. The chamber's existence remains unverified. Official tours of the Apostolic Archive make no mention of it. No inventory lists such a box or mirror. Yet the motto appears in a stray folio catalogued decades later, matching the description word for word. Was the sheet misplaced, or did someone preserve it as a token of the custodian's truth? The ambiguity ensures the story endures, resting between testimony and legend. Outside, in the broader halls, other keepers claim to hear doors creak without touch, as though hinges remembered movements of the past. The tilted cross became a whispered symbol, a sketch passed between scribes as a sign of doubt, of something seen but not confirmed. Perhaps that is the archive's greatest power, not in hiding truths, but in birthing legends that blur with facts until no lock can separate them. The old custodian died with his keys on the table beside him, the ledger closed on the final tally. His successor, leafing through his notes, found the description of the box, the mirror, and the parchment. Some dismissed it as allegory, a private prayer disguised as memory. Others believed the man had stumbled into a threshold never meant to open, a door that appears only once in a lifetime. Whatever the case, the room entered history not through official decree, but through the fragile ink of one man's recollection. In the end, perhaps that is the essence of these hidden halls. truth and imagination coiling together, neither fully real nor wholly false. And so the path continues, deeper still, where another threshold waits. This one does not bear a leaning cross, but its frame hums faintly, as though stones themselves anticipate the turning of a key. Beyond the tilted cross and the mirror that gave no face, the archive opened into its more official vastness. Corridors arranged like veins, stretching nearly 80 kilometers in total length. Scholars who earned the rare permission to step within often compared it to walking through the bones of a sleeping beast. Each shelf a rib, each cabinet a joint, each locked drawer a heart that never beat in daylight. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, renamed from the more ominous Secret Archive not so long ago, was never a single room but a world beneath a world, layered in permissions. The entry alone was a ritual. At the first gate, a guard checked the scholar's credentials against a ledger handwritten each morning. At the second, a clerk reviewed the purpose of study, marking the intended manuscripts. At the third, silence ruled, and the sound of quill scratching replaced voices. Few were permitted to pass further, for each door beyond carried a deeper degree of classification. To most, this layering seemed a natural safeguard, protecting fragile manuscripts from carelessness. Yet whispers persisted that it was not the parchment, but the narratives they carried that required such thickness of lock and ritual. Among the labyrinth of drawers, some held catalogue numbers, tidy labels etched on brass. But every so often, a scholar spoke of a drawer without designation. One story, repeated in different accents, spoke of drawer number none, a cabinet standing flush against the wall without inscription. When pulled, it resisted, then slid open as though exhaling. Inside lay not parchment, but a single folded note. In black script it read, "Lascia che riposi," let it rest. Beneath the words, a faint seal had once been pressed, though the wax had long since cracked. Some described the impression as a lion, others as a cross within a circle, still others as nothing recognizable at all. No one agreed, and no official photograph was ever permitted. A young researcher named Giovanni told his companions of a day when he glimpsed that very drawer. He had lingered after hours, lost in the maze, and when he placed his hand on the cabinet, he felt it shudder like a living creature. Against better judgment, he pulled it open and found not only the note, but a thin slip of paper stained with what seemed like blood. On it were 2 words, illegible at first glance, perhaps a name, perhaps only the remnants of ink washed by water. When he looked up, the air in the corridor shimmered, and he swore he heard a stone voice murmur, "Leave it, or the walls will speak." Giovanni never returned to the archive. His colleagues laughed at his fright, but none could explain why his research request was suddenly and permanently denied. You feel the weight of so many drawers, endless wood against stone, each handle like an invitation and a warning. Your fingertips hover over the brass, cold and smooth, and for an instant you imagine pulling one open to find not a manuscript, but your own handwriting already waiting there, though you had never set pen to it. The silence hums around you, reminding you that in such places, imagination is not a luxury, but a burden. The official structure of the archive has been detailed in guides, over 35,000 volumes, documents spanning more than 12 centuries, treaties, papal bulls, correspondences between emperors and popes. Yet within that sea of record, anomalies surface like islands, out of place and unaccounted for, an envelope dated but unsigned, a manuscript missing its final page, a ledger of donations whose ink runs clear only in one column. Each is small enough to dismiss, yet together they form a constellation of unanswered questions. Why? Secret archive. Defenders claim the word secretum in Latin simply means private, belonging to the Pope rather than the public. And yet, privacy is a fragile veil. The change of name to Apostolic Archive was meant to ease suspicion, but it did little to erase centuries of whispers. If privacy were the only purpose, why the legends of drawers that warn, of rooms that erase reflections, of columns of cold that never cease? Perhaps secrecy is not a matter of translation, but of habit, ingrained over generations until even a harmless ledger feels forbidden. Scholars who entered spoke of the sensation of being watched, not by guards or cameras, but by the shelves themselves. One compared it to standing in a forest where every tree listens. Another said it was like walking through the chambers of a mind that refused to forget. Perhaps they were only overwhelmed by the gravity of history pressed so close. Or perhaps, in those vast corridors, memory takes on a life of its own, watching those who dare disturb it. The unmarked drawer with its simple message remains one of the most enduring mysteries. A note that says, "Let it rest." Is it a plea from a weary scribe, warning against reopening some wound? Is it a command from authority, ensuring that certain knowledge never stirs? Or is it, as some suggest, the archive itself speaking, reminding intruders that not all questions require answers? Even the choice of language, Italian rather than Latin, unsettles scholars. Why write in the tongue of the common people within the most elite of archives? Was it meant to be read by everyone, or only by those who stumbled upon it by chance? Years later, a visiting cardinal dismissed the story, claiming no such drawer existed. Yet his own secretary, in a private letter, confessed to dreaming repeatedly of a hand sliding open wood, of reading the very words, "Lasciaci riposi," night after night. Dreams cannot serve as evidence, but they do leave their mark. And in the realm of the archive, dream and document often mingle until they are indistinguishable. The deeper you imagine walking, the more the air thickens. Dust carries the weight of centuries, settling on tongue and eyelid alike. Your steps echo, yet not as footsteps, but as pages turning. Somewhere, another key turns, another drawer sighs. Whether opened by human hand or by time itself remains uncertain. And so, the Apostolic Archive continues to guard its thresholds, a fortress of knowledge where the greatest lock may not be metal, but silence. Its corridors stretch like a labyrinth designed not to be solved, but to be wandered, forever circling, forever holding back just enough to keep curiosity awake. Beyond this wing, another chamber waits, where a letter once crossed oceans and centuries, a letter whose words would change the fate of a man who dared say the earth itself moved. In the hush of the archive, where drawers whispered warnings and corridors bent like veins, there rested a letter that carried the tremor of the cosmos itself. It was dated 1613, written by a man whose eyes had traced the stars through lenses ground with his own hands. Galileo Galilei, mathematician, astronomer, heretic to some, prophet of motion to others. The letter had long been known, its words copied and preserved in London, but in the Vatican's possession lay a different draft, a twin with small deliberate wounds. The discovery in 2019 startled the scholarly world, for it revealed not only history's record, but history's correction. In the London version, Galileo wrote boldly, defending Copernican theory, that the earth did not sit unmoving at the universe's heart, but circled instead like a humble pilgrim. He argued that Scripture was not meant as a book of science, that faith and the heavens need not collide. Yet the Vatican's draft showed softened edges, words of certainty blurred into caution, phrases of defiance reshaped into humility. Where the London copy thundered, the Vatican's whispered. To some, It suggested Galileo himself had tempered his arguments to appease authority. To others, it was evidence of another hand, unseen, reshaping his voice to suit the trial that would follow. The ink of the Vatican copy bore strange differences. Certain letters thickened as though retouched, while others faded unnaturally. Analysis showed no obvious forgery, yet the uneven strokes hinted at hesitation. Was Galileo pressured to revise, or did a scribe later adjust his words to present him as less defiant, more reckless, so the sentence of heresy might appear justified? The debate continues, for no one can prove whose pen bent those lines. Imagine the candlelit chamber where the letter rests, the parchment breathing faintly beneath glass. You lean closer, and the script seems alive, words trembling as though still deciding what to say. The black ink gleams in places, dulled in others, like constellations fading into dawn. You almost hear Galileo's mutter, that the earth spins despite decree, that truth does not bow to edict. Yet between his defiance and the Church's judgment lies this fragile sheet, half witness, half suspect. Galileo's trial of 1633 is well known. He was ordered to recant, and under the weight of robes and glares, he bent his head. The verdict placed him under house arrest, confined to his villa outside Florence. Officially, he was silenced, yet legend insists that as he rose from the courtroom, he murmured, "Epper si muove," and yet it moves. The phrase has no contemporary proof, only later testimonies. Did he truly whisper it? Or did those who admired him craft the line to keep his defiance alive? The uncertainty only deepens the myth, for absence of evidence often sharpens belief. Somewhere in the Vatican, the softened letter rests beside records of his condemnation, a pair of voices in conflict. One declares conviction, the other caution. Between them, a life was broken and preserved simultaneously. He continued his work in secret, studying motion, inventing telescopes, until blindness overtook him. Even in darkness, he dictated theories that would one day shape Newton's laws. His punishment confined his body, but not his vision, which stretched further than walls could contain. Why two versions of the same letter exist remains a matter of dispute. One possibility is simple. Galileo drafted two copies, one strong, one softened, sending the bolder abroad while keeping the safer within Italy. Another theory whispers of intervention, that the Vatican altered his words after the fact, preserving an edited script to justify the Inquisition's harshness. The discovery of the draft centuries later rekindled the debate, casting shadows on verdicts thought long settled. The truth, like the earth itself, continues to move beneath the surface. You picture him at his desk, quill scratching, candle wax dripping in uneven pools. Outside, the Florentine night spread stars like grains across velvet, the very stars he had charted. Each mark of ink was a challenge to the stillness decreed by tradition. His hand trembled, not from doubt, but from urgency, and yet somewhere, some hand, his or another's, softened those marks, clipped the wings of the words, tethered them to obedience. The parchment has aged, but not surrendered. Fibers hold firm, the script legible, daring the centuries. Its survival is itself a statement. Truth delayed, not erased. The Vatican has since acknowledged the existence of both versions, though without admitting guilt of alteration. Scholars pore over every stroke, every blot, as if the pen itself could confess. No confession comes, only silence heavy as stone. What makes this letter more than artifact is its implication. If the Church did shape his words, then history itself was guided by scissors unseen. If Galileo revised of his own accord, then even the bravest minds knew the price of candour. Either way, the document reminds us that truth is rarely unedited. It bends under pressure, then straightens when read by later eyes. Perhaps that is why the legend of his whispered defiance endures, to give balance to the softened lines, to remind us that silence never fully triumphs. In the archive, drawers creak, air cools, and the echo of epicy move lingers though never proven. It moves, whether spoken or not, whether written or erased. The earth spins, indifferent to ink and edict alike. And so, stepping away from the glass, you feel the hum of the vault again. A pulse that has carried countless verdicts and countless questions. The path bends onward, past the chamber of Galileo's trial, toward another hidden drawer where the fate of knights and kings would hinge on words of absolution, penned in secrecy and forgotten in plain sight. The path through the archive thickened into silence after the echo of Galileo's whispered defiance. Shelves loomed on either side like frozen sentinels, their edges grey with dust, their brass handles dull but unyielding. A faint scent of wax clung to the air, as though candles once burned here without ever being extinguished. To walk deeper was to step not merely into history, but into the pause between verdicts, into a space where centuries exhaled slowly, holding their breath until the next secret stirred. It is in such pauses that interludes occur, not of words written, but of the act of remembering. After the first 8 hidden drawers and shadowed chambers, a traveller through this labyrinth would stop to measure the weight of what had been uncovered. The vault, with its column of cold air, the mirror that erased the self, the motto that declared truth's endurance, the unmarked drawer, warning Lascia che riposi, and now, Galileo's letter, softened or reshaped, his whispered phrase, both legend and defiance. Together, these fragments already formed a pattern. History preserved not as record, but as negotiation, each truth trimmed, each silence deliberate. One could imagine pausing in a small alcove between wings of the archive, where a wooden bench rests beneath a high window slit. The glass above allows no real light, only a dim greyness that suggests daylight beyond the stone. It is here that scholars sometimes place their satchels, pausing to wipe ink from their fingers, to let their eyes adjust from script to shadow. In such moments, the archive itself seemed to breathe, reminding them they were only visitors in a house built not for discovery, but for endurance. You sit here in imagination, letting the stillness wrap around you like a cloak. The silence is not empty. It pulses faintly, as though distant pages are turning themselves. Your breath slows, your heartbeat softens, and the memory of the first secrets drifts like smoke. It is a place to gather threads before continuing, for the labyrinth is too vast to walk without pauses. The echo sentence returns. Truth does not fear time. You hear it not as command, but as lullaby, whispered again and again down the stone halls. Each time it repeats, it changes tone. Once it sounds like courage, another time like warning. Then, like resignation, the words fold into themselves, carrying both defiance and fatigue, as though the very stones cannot decide whether truth is shield or burden. From this alcove, one can trace a faint line across centuries. The year 1307, when knights in white mantles were dragged in chains through Paris, accused of heresy and treachery. The year 1613, when Galileo's letter first argued the heavens in motion. The year 1633, when his defiance was pressed into submission. Each date flickers like a candle on the wall, forming a fragile timeline across the vault. These are not separate secrets, but a sequence, each one echoing into the next. The interlude holds its own kind of mystery. Here, in the pause, legends creep in. Some claim that after every 5 chambers, the archive itself insists on rest, that doors refuse to open until silence has been kept for a span of breaths. Guards spoke of hearing soft chimes not from bells above, but from within the walls, as if unseen clocks measured their own rhythm. Others said the stone floor seemed warmer in these alcoves, as though fire smouldered beneath, unseen but alive. Fact or fancy, no one stayed long enough to confirm. Rest was brief, for curiosity soon tugged them forward. There is a tenderness to these halts, like the moment before sleep when thoughts blur but do not yet vanish. The mind drifts through the corridors already passed, stitching together images, a mirror with no reflection, parchment inked by a hand that should not have been, drawers with warnings instead of records. In this drift, the details blend with imagination, becoming harder to distinguish. That, too, is part of the archive's power, to blur until doubt feels like truth, and truth like dream. Consider again Galileo seated at his desk, quill raised. Imagine the trial room where men in robes demanded obedience. Imagine the drawer without a name, breathing its warning. Each fragment, when recalled here in the pause, feels less like isolated story and more like a single whispering choir. They harmonize in shadow, carrying the same refrain: truth, silence, time. Some historians argue that such legends distract from the archive's real treasure, its tangible manuscripts, its documented treaties, its verifiable papal decrees. Yet others counter that the myths themselves are the archive's living body, the marrow that gives it presence beyond parchment. Without them, the archive would be only shelves and dust. With them, it becomes a labyrinth that can never be fully mapped, for imagination itself becomes one of its chambers. The alcove grows quieter, as though even the stones rest now. No drawers open, no footsteps echo. Only the pulse of the phrase remains. Truth does not fear time. Your eyes close, and in the darkness behind them, the words drift like stars across a night sky. For a moment, you forget where you sit, whether in Rome, in a chamber beneath it, or only in the folds of memory. The boundary blurs, which is precisely what the archive demands. And then, gently, as though urged by the turning of a hidden key, the silence releases you. The pause has ended. The path resumes. Somewhere ahead lies a parchment older than ink, a scroll sealed by the church itself and forgotten in plain sight. It tells of knights once condemned and yet quietly absolved, of absolution hidden as carefully as guilt. The alcove fades, the bench empties, and the corridor stretches onward, carrying you into the next chamber of secrecy. The corridor bent once more, and the air shifted, as if stone itself exhaled a memory kept too long. Shelves gave way to a chamber smaller than most, lined not with endless drawers, but with a single table, its surface marked by grooves of quills long dead. Here lay the parchment, known as chignon, a fragile sheet that carried both condemnation and pardon, a secret folded into the heart of history. In 1307, the Knights Templar were seized across France, dragged from their commanderies, accused of spitting upon the cross, of heresy, of secret rituals whispered in vaults by torchlight. Their wealth had grown immense, their networks spanning kingdoms, and their discipline on the battlefield had made them indispensable. Yet their very power turned against them. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt owed to the Templars' treasury, sought deliverance not through repayment, but through destruction. With the papacy under his shadow, the arrests began. The world remembers them condemned, broken under torture, burned at the stake. Yet the parchment held at Chinon, discovered centuries later in a Vatican folder misfiled under an obscure heading, tells another story. It records that Pope Clement V quietly absolved the leaders of the order. Behind closed doors, away from royal ears, the Pope acknowledged their confessions, accepted their repentance, and lifted the weight of eternal damnation. Officially, they were forgiven. Unofficially, they were abandoned. The contradiction sits heavy in ink, a decision both merciful and damning. One line on the parchment stands out in faded brown. Veritas eorum omnes nos destrue. Their truth will destroy us all. Whether this was a note by the scribe, a whispered phrase overheard, or an insertion after the fact remains debated. Scholars have argued over its meaning. Was it fear of the Templars' secrets, their rumoured rituals of initiation, or simply a recognition that acknowledging their innocence would unravel the political scaffolding of the trial? The line resists explanation, but it lingers like smoke long after fire has died. You picture the chamber in Chinon Castle where this absolution took place, the stone walls damp, the torches guttering, the men kneeling with chains still heavy on their wrists, their voices hoarse, their faces pale from confinement, yet hope flickering in the promise of pardon. And yet, the world outside those walls never heard of it. The trial rolled forward, the executions continued, and history recorded only their guilt. It was as though the parchment itself had been locked away in silence, its words sealed not only with wax, but with intent. The parchment was lost to sight for centuries, misfiled until 2001, when it was rediscovered by archivist Barbara Frail. Its survival was almost accidental, the result of a misplaced folder that no one thought to search. When revealed, it shook the foundations of medieval history, suggesting that the Pope had sought reconciliation while the King pursued vengeance. Yet the contradiction only sharpened suspicion. Why had the document not been used to defend the Templars at their trial? Was Clement V too afraid of Philip's power? Did he hope to save their souls even while abandoning their lives? You lean closer to the imagined parchment. Its edges curl like dried leaves, the ink faint but legible. The Latin words seem to whisper, not with certainty, but with hesitation, as though the scribe's hand trembled under pressure. The seal at the bottom, once vivid with wax, is cracked, its impression blurred. Was it the papal bull's full authority, or a lesser mark of delegation? Scholars debate endlessly, but the parchment refuses final verdict. There is something profoundly unsettling about mercy hidden. A pardon given in secret is no pardon at all, for the world continues to burn the accused as guilty. What purpose did Clement's absolution serve, if not to save the bodies of his knights? Perhaps it was only to ease his own conscience, to claim before God that he had forgiven even as he surrendered them to politics. In that sense, the parchment stands as both salvation and betrayal, a double-edged relic of power. Legends spun quickly around it. Some whispered that a copy of the parchment was smuggled out, carried by surviving Templars who fled into exile. They claimed it formed the basis of later secret societies, proof that the Church itself had once declared them pure. Others insisted the parchment was itself a later forgery, crafted by hands eager to redeem the fallen knights. Yet forensic study of ink and parchment supports its authenticity. Still, authenticity cannot untangle intent. Was it a shield never raised or a sword never drawn? The voices of the condemned echo still. Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master, burned in 1314, is said to have cried out that both king and pope would soon answer before God. Within a year, Philip IV was dead, followed by Clement V. To those who loved myth, this was divine retribution. To historians, coincidence. But when paired with the parchment of absolution, the story thickens, as if fate itself confirmed the knight's final curse. You feel the room narrowing, the stone pressing close. The parchment breathes faintly on the table, whispering that truth may be written yet not spoken, that words may absolve but actions condemn. It is not only the Templars who were judged, but the very idea of justice bent beneath the weight of politics. In the quiet of the archive, where the Chinon parchment rests, a lesson lingers, that history can be both merciful and cruel in the same stroke. that absolution whispered in shadows cannot prevent flames in the square. It is this tension that makes the document so haunting, not only for what it says, but for what it allowed to continue. And so the corridor leads on, carrying the echo of knights pardoned and betrayed, their ashes scattered, yet their names enduring. Ahead lies not the memory of warriors, but the silence of a pope faced with war, a man holding letters he dared not send, torn between the light of truth and the fire it would ignite. The vaults beyond the parchment of Chinon breathed heavier, as though each step pressed deeper into the marrow of power itself. The silence here was not empty, but weighted, like coins stacked in unseen chambers. If the Templar story ended in flames, it also lingered in ledgers, for these knights were not only warriors draped in white mantles, but bankers whose influence stretched from castle to caravan. To walk into this part of the archive was to hear the faint rustle of contracts, the echo of coins sliding across tables long turned to dust. The Order of the Temple, founded in the early 12th century to guard pilgrims in the Holy Land, soon became more than swords at the ready. They devised a system that allowed a traveller to deposit wealth in Paris and withdraw its equivalent in Acre. A piece of parchment became as strong as gold, marked with codes only Templar eyes could decipher. It was the first form of international banking, cloaked in prayer but sharpened with calculation. Kings entrusted their treasuries to these knights. Merchants placed their fortunes in their care, and pilgrims found safety in their vouchers. Within the Vatican's shadowed drawers are fragments of these documents, slips of parchment with faded marks, some resembling crosses intersected with circles, others bearing strange geometric symbols that seem like drafts of ciphers. One fragment describes a transfer of funds between Poitiers and Jerusalem, but the amount is marked not in numbers, but in signs resembling constellations. Scholars debate whether these were codes meant to disguise value or ritual symbols meant to invoke protection. Either way, they hint at a network so intricate that even centuries of confiscation could not erase its traces. You pause and feel the weight of such power. Imagine holding a slip no larger than a palm, yet with it being able to claim chests of coin across the sea. The parchment rustles between your fingers like a talisman, fragile yet commanding. The ink, though faded, still carries the smell of iron gall, metallic and bitter. It is not only money but trust woven into the fibres, trust strong enough to bind kingdoms. But with such wealth came suspicion. Were the Templars serving God or Mammon? Chronicles describe them as both monks and merchants, kneeling in prayer yet calculating interest. Their vow of poverty clashed with their reputation for abundance. Their simple white mantles hiding coffers deeper than kings. By the 13th century, rumours spread of hidden treasuries, of vaults beneath Paris filled with gold and relics. Some whispered of a chest containing maps to lands not yet known to Christendom, others of a chalice too radiant to touch. No ledger confirms these, yet the absence of proof only fed the legends. One peculiar item rests in a Vatican file, a wooden tablet etched with compass and sun, symbols long associated with navigation. Its provenance is unclear, but a note attached calls it Templar inventory mark, unclaimed. Some argue it was a tool for calculating exchange rates using solar positions. Others insist it was part of a greater code, a reminder of lands and routes the order kept secret. The truth remains as obscure as the carving, but the image of a knight banker holding both sword and compass lingers in imagination. Not all contemporaries condemn them. Chroniclers admitted the Templars were efficient, their systems safer than carrying coin through lawless roads. Yet envy gnawed at kings, and suspicion grew among commoners. If a pilgrim entrusted his fortune to the knights, who ensured he would see it again? Stories spread of accounts erased, of fortunes disappearing in the smoke of secrecy. These tales, true or not, deepened mistrust. When Philip IV struck, it was not only for debt, but for the chance to seize records and treasures too complex to be challenged. Even today, the fate of the Templar treasury remains one of history's alluring shadows. Some argue it was absorbed into royal coffers, others that it vanished with fleeing knights, carried by ships that left French ports under moonlight and never returned. A few daring theories suggest the Vatican itself preserved fragments of wealth, not coin, but knowledge, ciphers, maps, ledgers that could not be allowed to fall into worldly hands. The compass and sun tablet, dusty and unassuming, could be such a remnant, a key to an equation lost. You imagine the vaults of Paris on the night of the arrests, candles snuffed, coins silent, drawers slammed shut, chains rattled above as knights were dragged away. But below in darkness, chests lay waiting, some seized, others perhaps spirited away through tunnels whispered to connect temple and river. Whether treasure escaped or perished, the story lived on, carried by each generation that sought what had been lost. The archive preserves more than parchment. It preserves the tension of wealth and sanctity entwined. The Templars prayed in chapels before riding into battle, yet their coffers outshone many thrones. They swore vows of chastity and poverty, yet ruled estates like princes. Were they saints betrayed by greed of others, or merchants cloaked in sanctity until greed revealed them? Historians argue still, and in their arguments the order survives. The faint clink of phantom coins follows you down the corridor. Somewhere deeper lies another chamber, not filled with ledgers of wealth, but with relics and records of power that may never have been meant for coin at all. For if knights once balanced prayer with banking, they also carried treasures that blurred the line between the sacred and the worldly, treasures that even the archive struggles to classify. The air shifts, promising not contracts and vouchers, but relics sealed in wood and whispers. Past the phantom clink of coins and the echo of ledgers lies another stratum of memory, darker and more entangled with myth. For beyond their role as bankers and warriors, the Knights Templar were also keepers of relics, objects both sacred and suspect. Some said to carry the weight of bloodlines older than Christendom itself. The archive does not parade these openly. They linger in notes half erased, in inventories with missing entries, in marginalia that hint at possessions never meant to be catalogued. What endures is less fact than shadow, but the shadow itself has power. One such shadow is the tale of the Merovingian kings, a dynasty that ruled the Franks centuries before the rise of the Carolingians. Dagobert II, the last of his line to wear the crown with full authority, was murdered in 679, his heirs erased from chronicles, his dynasty cut off like a candle's flame. Yet fragments preserved in medieval manuscripts whisper otherwise, that a branch of his bloodline survived in secrecy, hidden in Languedoc, carried quietly through convent walls and noble marriages. The Templars, who established strongholds in that very region, were suspected of guarding not only castles, but descendants, heirs by blood to a kingdom forgotten. Among the curiosities of the archive is a parchment that lists the names of noble families in southern France, annotated with symbols beside certain branches. One line bears a white ribbon drawn in margin, fragile as though meant for no one's eyes. Scholars have puzzled over it for generations. Was it simply a scribe's ornament, or a code marking a family of significance? Some argue it signifies nothing more than clerical flourish. Others see in it the echo of a hidden inheritance, a bloodline meant to be remembered in silence. Imagine the halls of a Templar commandery in Languedoc, the walls heavy with banners, the air sharp with pine smoke. A knight bows before a child wrapped in wool, his hands rough from sword practice, yet gentle as he offers protection. Perhaps the child was ordinary, perhaps not. If the whispers are true, that wool-clad infant carried Merovingian blood, a thread of royalty spared from assassination. If false, then the image remains a haunting fiction, one powerful enough to bend the imagination of centuries. The Merovingians themselves carried strange reputations. Chroniclers describe them as kings with uncut hair, their long locks considered symbols of divine authority. To cut the hair of a Merovingian prince was to strip him of legitimacy, to render him unfit to rule. Some likened this to Samson's strength bound in his hair, suggesting a sacred inheritance woven into strands. A few coins from the dynasty, preserved in numismatic collections, even depict kings with flowing locks, their features blurred but their hair unmistakable. That detail fed later legends that their bloodline was no ordinary one. What if the Templars believed they served not only Christendom, but a lineage tied to older sanctity? Some historians scoff, calling such theories inventions of later centuries, fantasies born of romanticism. Yet the presence of those marginal marks, those white ribbons in lists of names, remains unexplained. If they meant nothing, why preserve the document at all? If they meant everything, why hide them in drawers where only whispers can find them? You lean closer to the imagined parchment, the ink faint, the ribbon symbol almost fragile enough to fade. The silence around it feels heavier than any vault of coins. To guard wealth is to guard metal. To guard a bloodline is to guard destiny. If true, then the Templars' fall was not only a matter of gold and power, but of inheritance too dangerous to acknowledge. Legends around Dagobert's descendants deepened in the medieval imagination. Some said a daughter fled into the Pyrenees, carrying with her documents of lineage sealed with wax. Others swore that monasteries in the region protected these heirs, cloaking them in anonymity until the time would come to rise again. By the time the Templars rose in prominence, these whispers had already spread, and so the association formed. Knights in white mantles shielding not only relics of the cross, but relics of flesh and blood. Was it true? The archive will not say. Official historians point out the lack of verifiable records, the silence of reliable chroniclers. They remind us that medieval rumour was fertile soil, easily sprouting myths that served political ends. Yet the fascination persists. For if a hidden line endured, then history itself may have been written with one eye closed, erasing kings to enthrone others. Such an erasure would make sense of the Vatican's silence, for bloodlines carry claims, and claims can fracture empires. You feel the corridor tighten again, as though history itself resists being pulled open. The air smells faintly of iron and dust, like parchment left too long in a damp chest. Each step draws you further into a space where facts blur into legend, where symbols in margins may weigh as heavily as papal bulls. And here lies the paradox. In trying to separate truth from myth, we feed both. For to question whether a bloodline endured is to keep the possibility alive. In the end, whether Dagobert's heirs survived or not may matter less than the fact that generations believed they did. The belief shaped stories, inspired quests, and haunted archives. And the Templars, whether guardians of kings or merely of rumour, remain bound to that legend as tightly as to their own. The path through the archive does not end here. Beyond the whispers of bloodlines and hidden heirs lies another chamber, quieter but sharper, where a man in a black mantle waits, not a knight this time, but a priest, a general without battlefield, yet commanding armies of minds. The superior general of the Jesuits, the so-called Black Pope, casts his shadow further down the hall, and the archive tightens its locks once again. The corridor folded inward, swallowing the whisper of Merovingian bloodlines into a deeper stillness. Here the archive seemed to pause deliberately, as if insisting on rest before yielding further secrets. The stones no longer pressed with menace but with patience. A quiet interlude, where past voices softened into echoes. It was the kind of silence that did not empty the mind but gathered threads, pulling together fragments from the chambers already crossed. 8 secrets had been opened, each one a drawer in a vast cabinet of memory. The first chamber, with its column of cold air, rising like the spine of the earth. The custodian's mirror that gave no reflection, unsettling in its erasure of self. The parchment declaring veritas non timet tempus. Truth does not fear time. The unmarked drawer bearing the warning lasciaci riposi. Galileo's letter, its words bent by unseen hands. His trial and the whispered defiance that may or may not have passed his lips. The sheen on parchment, offering secret absolution to knights condemned in fire. And finally, the tangled legacy of the Templars' banking and the possibility of a bloodline shielded in silence. Each one rested now in memory's alcove, forming a constellation whose points were distant yet faintly aligned. You imagine yourself seated in a narrow recess of the archive, a bench beneath a slit of stone where no light enters, only a suggestion of day. The air is cool, but not harsh, like a breath held in anticipation. Around you, the shelves recede into darkness, their weight felt more than seen. It is a place not of discovery, but of pause, a moment when the mind is invited to weave threads rather than seek new ones. The archive seems to know that without stillness, its labyrinth would overwhelm. The refrain returns, a phrase repeated through stone. Truth does not fear time. It comes like a heartbeat, first steady, then faint, then steady again, as though the very walls repeat it when breath has grown shallow. Each repetition bends in meaning. At first, it feels like courage, as if the archive itself were daring its secrets to endure. Then it feels like fatigue, as if truth were weary of waiting centuries to be seen. Then, strangely, it becomes a lullaby, a chant that lulls rather than rouses. Here in the pause, patterns begin to surface. The column of cold air in the first chamber feels less like anomaly and more like symbol, a spine of stone breathing questions. The mirror with no reflection pairs with Galileo's edited words, both erasures of identity, one of face, the other of voice. The sheen on parchment, granting pardon while delivering men to flames, mirrors the unmarked drawer's warning to let it rest, each a mercy given with one hand and denied with the other. Even the white ribbon beside a family name in Languedoc echoes the fractured seals on Templar ledgers, each mark fragile but heavy with implication. It is said that archivists themselves feel these patterns in their dreams. One recorded waking night after night with visions of drawers opening of their own accord, papers fluttering out like wings. Another spoke of hearing a bell toll deep underground, though no such bell existed within the walls. Dreams cannot be documented, yet within this labyrinth they gain a weight almost equal to parchment. For what is history if not a dream inked down? The interlude has its legends too. Some guards swore that after every set of 5 secrets, a natural stillness fell, as though the archive itself demanded silence. Doors would stiffen, candles dim without wind, and no drawer could be opened until the pause had been observed. They called it the breath of the stones. Skeptics dismiss it as fatigue, the mind imposing order where there is only chance. But in the heavy hush of these recesses, the idea of an archive that breathes feels less like metaphor than fact. You close your eyes and allow the corridor to dissolve. The 8 secrets hover like lanterns in the dark, each glowing faintly. The first glimmers icy blue, the second silver and empty, the third warm with faded ink, the fourth with a cracked red seal, the fifth in black smudges of Galileo's trembling words, the sixth burning with the imagined whisper, and yet it moves, the seventh in brown parchment smoke, and the eighth in the pale sheen of a ribbon. They form a line stretching across centuries, a hidden constellation charted not in the heavens, but in the memory of stone. The pause does not last forever. The stillness is not meant to end the journey, but to strengthen it. Soon another shadow approaches, darker and more deliberate. A man, not in armour, but in cassock. Not a king, but a general of priests. He is called the Superior General, yet the whispers name him otherwise. The Black Pope, commander of vows, master of obedience. The next chamber awaits his shadow. But before stepping into that hall of fear and discipline, you breathe once more in the alcove, gathering the whispers already collected. And so the interlude closes softly, not with revelation, but with readiness. The refrain lingers one final time, carried by the stone, by the dust, by the silent breath of centuries. Truth does not fear time. Then the echo fades, and the corridor stirs again, guiding you toward the chamber where the black mantle hangs heavy, and silence bends into command. The stillness of the interlude gave way to a different kind of silence, not the restful breath of stone, but the sharpened quiet that comes before a command. The corridor seemed to narrow here, as if the walls themselves obeyed some invisible authority. It is in this chamber that shadows thickened into a figure robed not in white but in black, a man without crown, yet called a pope, a general without battlefield, yet commanding an army that spanned continents, the superior general of the Society of Jesus, whispered as Il Papa Oscuro, the Black Pope. The Jesuits had been founded in the 16th century by Ignatius of Loyola, a soldier turned mystic whose vision of service demanded absolute obedience. Their order grew swiftly, sending missionaries across the globe, establishing schools, advising princes, and weaving influence into the very fabric of Catholic power. Yet, it was the office of their leader, the Superior General, that stirred the greatest unease. Unlike most orders, where abbots answered to bishops and abbesses to popes, the Jesuits were bound directly to the general, whose command they swore to obey as though his voice were God's. In time, this obedience earned him the title of Black Pope, a counterpart to the Pope of white robes, a ruler within a ruler. The archive preserves portraits of these generals, painted in muted tones, their eyes often downcast, their features blurred as though resisting clarity. One portrait, attributed to the 17th century, shows a man seated at a desk, hands folded, but his face is curiously smudged. The paint darkened over time until it looks almost erased. Some art historians say it is simply the decay of pigments. Others suspect deliberate alteration, a decision to obscure his identity. The painting hangs not in galleries, but in storage, where only a few curators have seen it. The absence of a face has become more haunting than its presence would ever be. Imagine stepping into a chamber lined with such portraits, each figure gazing, or perhaps refusing to gaze, back at you. The silence is weighted, as though voices have been swallowed whole. The air smells of old oil and varnish, faintly bitter, clinging to the tongue. In this hall, power is not shouted, but whispered, not shown, but implied. What gave the Superior General such influence was the structure of obedience. The Jesuit constitutions describe their vow with unsettling clarity: to be as a corpse in the hands of superiors, to surrender will and judgment, to move only where commanded. The phrase is stark: perinde ac cadaver, just like a corpse. To some, It was the ultimate expression of humility, a way to free oneself of pride and submit entirely to divine mission. To others, it was a chilling abdication of conscience, a surrender so complete that it bred fear of what such an order might do if guided by ambition. You can almost feel the weight of such a vow pressing against your own chest. Imagine standing before a general in his black cassock, hearing the words spoken, that you are no longer your own, that your thoughts and choices are dissolved into obedience. For some, this surrender might bring peace, a relief from the burden of decision. For others, it would feel like vanishing, like the mirror that once erased a custodian's face. Critics across centuries painted the Jesuits as manipulators, whisperers in courts, shadows in parliaments. They were accused of meddling in politics, of steering monarchs toward or away from war, of pulling strings invisible to the public eye. Their reputation as educators only deepened suspicion, for to shape the minds of the young is to shape the world's future. Kings and queens at times admired their loyalty, at times feared their reach. In 1773, the order was even suppressed by papal decree under pressure from European rulers, a testament to how threatening their discipline appeared. Yet 4 decades later, they were restored, their presence woven once more into the Church's core. The term Black Pope itself is debated. Some say it arose simply from the contrast of his black cassock to the Pope's white robes. Others claim it reflected the darker perception of his hidden power, authority exercised behind curtains, without ceremony. The Vatican denies the title officially, yet it persists, echoed in books, in letters, in whispers across centuries. Whether metaphor or reality, the name has stuck. A shadow that clings as tightly as the cassock. One curious document found in a private folder of the archive is a sketch of a Jesuit chapel, drawn not by an architect but by a student. In its corner is scrawled the phrase, Il Papa Oscuro, the earliest known use of the term. Scholars argue whether it was jest, critique, or simple rumour, but the handwriting bears the tremor of a hand, nervous even in the act of writing. That small note, half joke, half fear, spread into legend, cementing the general as a figure larger than life. The balance between reverence and dread defines the Jesuit legacy. Their contributions to science, philosophy, and art are immense. They charted stars, mapped rivers, wrote dictionaries of languages otherwise lost. Yet in the minds of their critics, all of this was mere scaffolding for control. Was their discipline a channel for divine order, or a mechanism of earthly dominance? The debate has never ceased. The corridor exhales again, as if the stones themselves grow wary of the shadow of command. The portraits fade into darkness. The vow still echoes. Perinde ac cadaver. The image of obedience absolute lingers, unsettling in its clarity. Ahead, however, the path widens into history, more turbulent still. The suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, their scattering across continents, their restoration in 1814. If the superior general's shadow haunts the chamber, then the next vault holds the thunder of decree, the clash of crowns and crosses that sought to silence the society and could not. The corridor widened into a hall where silence carried not only the weight of vows, but the thunder of decrees. The Jesuits, once the most disciplined arm of the Church, had stretched their reach so widely across kingdoms that suspicion grew louder than praise. By the mid-18th century, their presence was a thread woven through courts, universities, and colonies, binding far-flung lands with the same black cassock. Yet that thread had grown too visible, too tight, and in 1773 it was cut by papal decree, scattering the Society of Jesus into exile. The document of suppression, Dominus ac Redemptor, rests within the archive in heavy Latin, its ink still dark. its seal cracked by time. In it, Pope Clement XIV declared that the order was dissolved for the sake of peace in the Church. The language was cautious, wrapped in formality, but beneath the words one can sense the tremor of pressure. Monarchs across Europe had demanded this act. France, Spain, Portugal, all kings who resented Jesuit influence over their courts, their colonies, their trade. It was not theology alone that fueled the decree, but politics, money, and fear of control that seemed to slip beyond royal grasp. A curious artifact preserved with the decree is the broken remnant of a wax seal, once stamped with papal authority. Half the impression remains, a cross, incomplete. The other half fractured away, as though history itself had snapped the emblem. Archivists cannot say when or how the seal broke, only that it now rests in a velvet pouch beside the parchment. Some claim the damage occurred during its original opening, others that it cracked during centuries of storage, yet the image of a broken cross beside a broken order is too striking to ignore, and legend has grown that the seal's fracture foretold the society's fall. Imagine the reaction within Jesuit houses when the decree arrived. In Paris, priests who had taught generations of nobles packed their books in silence, their libraries shuttered. In Lisbon, missionaries returning from Brazil were stripped of titles, their reports shelved and forgotten. In Rome itself, chapels fell quiet, their altars left to dust. Some Jesuits obeyed without protest, dispersing into secular life. Others resisted quietly, teaching in disguise, preserving fragments of their order's discipline in hidden circles. The vow of obedience that had once united them now turned to silence, a silence of endurance. You can almost hear the doors slamming shut across Europe, echoes rolling like thunder through corridors once filled with prayer. The halls grow emptier in imagination, each Jesuit school a hollow shell, each mission station a relic abandoned. And yet, beneath the hush, something stirred still. Seeds sown in minds and hearts did not vanish with decrees. Students taught by Jesuits carried their methods elsewhere. Ideas continued, even without cassocks. Suppression silenced the order's body, but not its voice. The decree of 1773 was not universally enforced. In Russia, Catherine the Great refused to publish it, valuing Jesuit skill as educators. She allowed them to remain, their schools operating in defiance of papal command. In Prussia too, Jesuits found refuge under Frederick the Great. Thus, while the order dissolved in much of Europe, it survived in pockets, alive in exile, waiting for return. The contradiction itself reveals the tension. Condemned in Rome, preserved abroad, a body both dead and breathing at once. 4 decades later, in 1814, the tide shifted. The papacy, recognizing the enduring strength of the Jesuits, restored the society through the bull Solicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum. The order returned, its black cassocks once again visible in the corridors of power. But restoration was not rebirth. The Jesuits of the 19th century inherited both suspicion and reverence, their reputation already shaped by suppression. They walked with the memory of fracture, their authority sharpened by survival, a detail often overlooked rests in the restoration document. The bull's parchment bears faint water stains in its lower margins, as though carried through rain. Some say it was presented during a ceremony where a storm broke overhead, soaking the paper before it could be sealed. Others dismiss it as later damage, yet for storytellers, the image is irresistible. The return of the Jesuits marked not by sunlight, but by storm, as though nature itself mirrored their tumultuous history. You feel the weight of these decrees pressing from both sides, one document dissolving an order, another reviving it. Between them lies 40 years of silence, of whispered teaching, of endurance beyond exile. The archive preserves both, side by side, as though to remind us that history is not linear, but cyclical. What is broken may be restored. What is silenced may yet sing again. Critics still debate the meaning of suppression and restoration. Some argue the order's fall proved their ambition had grown too vast, their obedience too dangerous to monarchs. Others suggest their revival proved their necessity, that the Church could not endure without their discipline, their intellect, their missionary zeal. Both views remain suspended in tension, like the cracked seal and the rain-stained parchment resting beside each other in drawers. In the stillness of the archive, you sense the echo of doors slamming shut, followed decades later by doors creaking open. The sound is not loud, but steady, a rhythm of suppression and return. The Jesuits, like the heartbeat of the Church itself, endure not by avoiding fracture, but by surviving it. The corridor stretches onward, carrying you deeper still. The next chamber is not filled with decrees, but with maps and instruments, with marks of voyages across seas and lands. The society's influence was not only in courts, but in classrooms and frontiers, where compasses, globes, and chalk carried as much weight as swords. Ahead waits the echo of classrooms and the quiet scrape of chalk, lessons that spread across continents, shaping minds in silence. The echo of slammed and reopened doors drifted into a quieter chamber, where sound was replaced by the scrape of chalk across slate. Here the archive shifted from decrees and papal bulls to ledgers of classrooms, syllabi, and correspondence between missionaries who measured their victories not in battles won, but in minds shaped. The Jesuit network of education was perhaps their most enduring creation. A lattice of schools and colleges that stretched across continents, teaching languages, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and theology with equal fervour. Among the drawers lies a thin wooden ruler, its surface worn smooth, its edge etched with faint marks that are not numbers but lines running parallel like latitudes. Beside it sits a note written in Latin, ad ordinandum orbem, to order the world. Whether this was merely a teacher's tool or a symbolic reminder of the Jesuit mission remains uncertain. Some see it as proof of their role in mapping and shaping more than geography, shaping the order of thought itself. Jesuit schools were established across Europe. Rome, Paris, Ingolstadt, Coimbra, each demanding rigour from students who would go on to become statesmen, scholars, and clerics. Their system emphasized not only learning, but discipline, binding intellectual growth to spiritual obedience. Lessons began at dawn, voices rising in unison to recite texts, the smell of ink and parchment heavy in the rooms. A visitor once described such a classroom as a battlefield of the mind, where silence and order themselves instruct. You imagine yourself seated at one of those wooden desks, the surface carved with faint initials from restless pupils long before. Chalk dust floats in the air, stinging the nose. A teacher in black cassock moves deliberately between rows, his hands steady on the ruler, tapping gently when attention falters. Outside, bells ring, but the lesson does not pause. The rhythm is strict yet strangely soothing, a cadence that anchors thought. Beyond Europe, their reach extended further still. In China, Matteo Ricci wore silk robes and spoke in fluent Mandarin, teaching Western astronomy to imperial scholars while absorbing Confucian classics. In the Americas, Jesuits catalogued plants, translated indigenous languages, and built missions where classrooms were as central as chapels. In Africa, they carried globes and compasses alongside crucifixes. Wherever they went, the black cassock carried not only prayers but instruments of measurement and knowledge. Some hailed this as enlightenment carried across oceans. Others condemned it as subtle conquest, shaping minds as surely as empires carve borders. One manuscript in the archive contains lists of native words from Paraguay, carefully recorded by Jesuit missionaries. The ink is faded, but the care evident, each syllable written with patient repetition. In the margins, sketches of plants appear, leaves curling in ink strokes. Scholars debate whether these were scientific notes or devotional reflections, attempts to capture creation itself. What is certain is that the Jesuits preserved languages and observations that might otherwise have been lost, even as they altered the cultures they encountered. Critics argue their schools trained obedience more than curiosity, that they moulded pupils to accept authority rather than to question. Supporters counter that their rigor cultivated some of the sharpest minds of the age, producing scientists, philosophers, and leaders whose influence stretched far beyond cloisters. The truth lies in the tension between discipline and inspiration, between a ruler that measures and a ruler that strikes. The archive holds letters from monarchs praising Jesuit education, requesting tutors for heirs, pleading for teachers in provinces. It also holds denunciations accusing them of indoctrination, of bending the young to the society's will. These contradictions coexist, filed side by side, as if daring the reader to decide which carries more weight. One particularly curious letter is unsigned, addressed only to the general. It speaks of a school in South America where children drew the sun not as a circle, but as a cross, blending old symbols with new instruction. The writer feared it was heresy. Others might see it as synthesis, cultures interwoven. The letter ends abruptly, the ink darker as if the writer's hand pressed harder, leaving behind more question than answer. You picture the globe of the Jesuits, a sphere marked not only with geography but with knowledge, lines of longitude stretching like vows, latitudes drawn as paths of obedience. Each coordinate a classroom, each crossing a lesson. The faint scratch of chalk becomes the heartbeat of the order, steady and insistent. In the quiet of the archive, these records remind us that empires of thought can endure beyond empires of stone. Even when suppressed, the Jesuit method lived in pupils who carried their training into other schools, other courts, other missions. Influence seeped like water through cracks, unstoppable once released, and yet shadows linger. How much of their teaching was liberation, and how much control? Did they preserve languages for love of knowledge, or to better guide conversion? Did they chart stars to expand science, or to claim authority over heaven, as well as earth? The questions cannot be resolved, for both motives may have lived side by side, inked into the same lessons. The corridor breathes again, the chalk dust settling. Ahead, the path bends toward Rome itself, into the Curia, where decisions were shaped not in classrooms, but in councils. The archive prepares to open another drawer, one filled not with rulers or globes, but with letters unsigned, decisions hinted, influence whispered. At the heart of the church itself, the scent of chalk and ink faded as the corridor deepened into marble silence, and the voices of students gave way to the murmur of council halls. Here the archive preserved not classrooms or ledgers of missions, but threads connecting the Jesuit order directly to the pulse of Rome. This was no frontier mission, but the heart of the Curia, where decisions shaped empires and faith alike. Letters, unsigned but weighted, hinted at influence woven quietly into papal corridors. The Jesuits' role in the Curia was never formally codified, yet their presence is felt in marginal notes, in private correspondence, in advisory roles left unnamed in official rosters. A drawer marked only by a black ribbon contains such papers. Letters written in elegant hand, ending without signature, their content sharp with instruction. One letter, addressed simply ad fratrem in curia, advises on appointments to episcopal sees, recommending men whose education traced back to Jesuit schools. Another refers to doctrinal debates, urging caution in public but firmness in private. Without names, they read like whispers overheard through stone. Among the more peculiar artifacts is a folded sheet of paper where the seal should be. Instead of wax, the paper bears only a deep indentation, as though pressed by a signet but never inked or coloured. The impression resembles the IHS monogram, the Jesuit emblem, yet faint enough to be dismissed as accident. Was it a deliberate choice to leave a mark without leaving evidence? The sheet rests today in a protective sleeve, its emptiness as striking as any bold signature. You imagine the chamber where such letters were read. Candlelight flickering across polished marble, the rustle of cassocks in motion, the smell of incense drifting from a chapel nearby. A cardinal leans close, his eyes narrowing at words that seem to speak directly to his doubt, though no author claims them. He folds the letter, slides it into a drawer, and locks it. The influence remains, the hand invisible but firm. The phrase Black Pope returns here with sharper resonance. It was one thing to suspect Jesuits of influence abroad, another to see their shadow close to the papal throne. Critics insisted the superior general ruled a hidden empire, pulling threads of curia decisions, whispering into ears that should hear only the Pope. Supporters countered that their advice was valued because it was wise, born of discipline and learning. Between these poles lies ambiguity, as enduring as the silence of the unsigned letters. Historians debate whether such influence was exaggerated. Some note that the Jesuits were often distrusted, even within the Vatican, their independence a source of tension. Others point to the restoration of the order in 1814 as proof that their absence was too costly, that their return was not only welcome but necessary for papal strength. The archive does not settle the argument. It only presents the evidence without conclusion, allowing whispers to echo louder than proclamations. One letter preserved in this section describes a meeting between a Jesuit advisor and Pope Pius VII after the order's restoration. The account, unsigned, records that the Pope asked whether the society had learned humility during suppression. The reply was brief: "Holiness, obedience never sleeps." Whether this exchange truly occurred is uncertain, but the phrase has lingered, repeated in later documents as a motto both reassuring and unsettling. You feel the corridor narrow again, the air tightening as though authority itself presses against your chest. The silence of the curia is unlike the silence of forgotten vaults. It is not empty, but heavy, filled with decisions too delicate to be spoken aloud. The unsigned letters seem to watch from their sleeves, demanding no recognition, yet commanding attention all the same. A debate persists even now. Were the Jesuits a church within the church, their loyalty divided between Pope and general? Or were they the Pope's most faithful arm, bound by vows of service so absolute that suspicion itself became inevitable? Both images persist in the archive, side by side, refusing resolution. And then comes a final curiosity. A sheet of parchment where lines of text have been carefully erased, scraped so thin the surface nearly breaks. Under angled light, faint words appear, enough to suggest that the text once described a circle within a circle, a phrase critics later seized as symbol of a hidden hierarchy. Was this metaphor, ritual, or simple scribal flourish? The erased words leave only shadow, the silence of removal louder than presence. The corridor breathes again, the marble cool beneath imagined hands. The Jesuit presence in the curia remains neither confirmed nor denied, suspended in drawers of unsigned counsel and erasures half visible. Ahead, however, lies a darker chamber still, not of education or quiet advice, but of vows themselves, the chilling words of obedience recited in rooms with no windows, the vow that likened men to corpses, surrendering thought and will alike, waits to be heard in full, whispered like an oath, carved into stone. The corridor shifted again, leaving behind the echo of vows and marble halls, to enter a chamber that smelled faintly of dust and ash. Here the archive offered not portraits or unsigned letters, but maps, drawn, erased, forbidden. A drawer creaked open to reveal parchment curled at the edges, its fibres brittle with centuries. The ink traced a city none had ever visited, a place named Civitas Solis. The map was unlike others of its age. No rivers curved across it, no mountains rose. Instead, it displayed a perfect circle, a walled city formed from concentric rings. At its heart stood a sun symbol, radiating lines that touched each quarter of the city like spokes of a wheel, streets aligned with the cycle of solstices and equinoxes, as though the city itself were built not for commerce or war, but for the rhythm of the heavens. Scholars who studied the drawing argued whether it was a memory, a plan, or a dream. Some likened it to Plato's Atlantis, others to the celestial diagrams of Islamic astronomers. None agreed, but all admitted the strangeness of its survival within Vatican drawers. One peculiarity marked the parchment. The walls were dotted with small black squares, each aligned precisely with lunar phases. Counting them revealed 28, a number too deliberate to dismiss. Was Civitas Solis meant to be a city where days and months were measured by stone, where architecture itself became a calendar? If so, it suggested knowledge far ahead of its time, or imagination carried to obsession. You lean closer to the imagined map. The ink, though faded, glimmers faintly when tilted, as though metallic dust had been mixed into pigment. The parchment smells faintly of smoke, as though once singed by fire. Along one margin is a faint note in Latin, urbs quae non est, the city that is not. Whether that was confession or mockery is unclear, but it deepens the enigma. Another map rests beneath, even stranger. It shows not a city, but architectural sketches of a basilica never built. The plan resembles St. Peter's, but altered. Its dome shifted eastward, its nave elongated into a spiral, its cross absent altogether. In its place is a circle, echoing the city plan of Civitas Solis. The lines are crisp, as though drawn with professional precision, yet no architect claims them. On one corner is a faded annotation, Memora, non aedificare. Remember, not build. Was this basilica a conceptual design, an exercise in geometry and theology? Or was it a proposal rejected, hidden because it challenged the very shape of worship? Some suggest it symbolized a worldview less centered on crucifixion, more on cosmic harmony. Others dismiss it as idle doodling by an apprentice. Yet its careful proportions suggest intention too strong to ignore. The juxtaposition of the two documents, the perfect city and the altered basilica, invites speculation. Were they linked? Did they reflect a philosophy where faith aligned with celestial cycles, where worship mirrored not cross but cosmos? The fact that both survive together in the same folder suggests a connection, even if lost to time. Legends swirl around these maps. Some say they were copied from texts carried back by crusaders, remnants of Eastern mysticism woven into Christian secrecy. Others claim they were drafts by Renaissance dreamers, imagining a city of sun before Michelangelo ever touched brush to Sistine plaster. A few more daring voices insist they reflect memory of places that once existed before ice, and flood erased them. The archive itself is silent, offering only parchment without context. You trace the imagined streets with your finger, feeling the pull of symmetry. The circular city feels strangely soothing, its design suggesting order that the world rarely grants. Yet the annotation, the city that is not, pricks like a thorn. To remember a city unbuilt is to carry longing for harmony never achieved. Perhaps that is the greatest purpose of the archive, not only to preserve what was, but to guard dreams that never touch stone. The smell of ash grows stronger, as if the parchments themselves resist being read too long. Some archivists whispered that those who lingered on Civitas Solus grew restless in their sleep, dreaming of streets that curved into circles, of suns that rose and never set. A custodian once recorded waking night after night with the same vision, walking through a city where bells rang without sound, where walls shifted like tides. He begged to be reassigned to other wings, and the drawer was closed for years. The map of the unbuilt basilica carries its own hauntings. Some saw in it the shadow of doubt. What if the church had not centered itself on cross and altar, but on circle and balance? Would faith have flowed differently? To preserve such a design is to admit possibility, to remember that even stone certainty could have been otherwise. The corridor hums faintly, as though geometry itself reverberates. You feel the pull of lines, the whisper of annotations written by hands long gone. The city that is not, the church never built. Both wait like questions unanswered. Ahead, however, another shadow stirs. The footsteps lead beneath frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo's sketches whisper doubt in graphite, where images never meant for eyes suggest that even the greatest artist wrestled with visions beyond orthodoxy. The corridor seemed to rise, narrowing toward a vaulted ceiling as though carrying you upward into the echo of paint and plaster. Here the archive's silence brushed against the footsteps of Michelangelo, the man who bent marble and fresco into visions of eternity. Beneath the brilliance of the Sistine Chapel lies another story, quieter, drawn in sketches not displayed to the public. They are fragments preserved in drawers, slips of paper bearing lines and shadows, too fragile to endure the grandeur above, yet powerful in their whispers. One such sketch carries the words, "Non sono solo." I am not alone. It shows the outline of a human figure, head bowed, eyes deliberately left blank. The sockets are smooth circles, vacant and haunting, as though the act of erasure was itself the point. Around the figure swirl faint lines resembling wings, though too indistinct to confirm. Some art historians interpret the drawing as Michelangelo's meditation on solitude, the artist's burden in labour that spanned years. Others believe the absence of eyes suggested something more profound, a vision of humanity stripped of sight, reliant on faith in darkness. Still others argue the phrase, "I am not alone," hints at companionship unseen, perhaps divine, perhaps haunting. The parchment itself bears smudges of graphite, fingerprints faint along the edges. Conservators who examined it noted the prints match those on other confirmed sketches of Michelangelo. To touch those marks in imagination is to touch the hand of the artist himself, the smears of his thought preserved as surely as the ceiling above preserves his triumphs. Yet this sketch remained hidden, never painted, never brought to marble. It lingers like a confession too intimate for public view. You lean close to the imagined drawing, the blank eyes staring back with greater weight than any detailed gaze. The phrase "non sono solo" vibrates strangely in the silence, less reassurance than uncertainty. Was Michelangelo speaking to himself or to some unseen presence that crowded his solitude? Another sketch in the same folder depicts a basilica, familiar in outline, but altered. Where the cross should stand at the central dome, the lines diverge into a spiral, curling outward. The plan resembles drafts for St. Peter's, yet departs deliberately, replacing cruciform geometry with circular flow. In the margin, a note in faint ink. Dubium est fides. Faith is doubt. Some argue the phrase was not Michelangelo's, but a later hand interpreting the drawing. Yet its presence, whether authentic or interpolated, unsettles the viewer. The image of a basilica without cross is difficult to reconcile. Was it an architectural experiment, geometry for geometry's sake? Or was it a vision of a different theology, where balance replaced sacrifice, where doubt itself became structure? Scholars remain divided, unwilling to declare certainty. What endures is the power of the sketch to unsettle, to remind that even the greatest servant of papal commission wrestled with lines that defied orthodoxy. Legends grew quickly around these drawings. Some whispered that Michelangelo left hidden figures within the Sistine frescoes, faces without eyes, shadows of spirals, gestures of quiet rebellion. Others dismiss such claims as fantasies of modern minds eager for conspiracy. Yet when paired with these sketches, the whispers gain weight, for the evidence lies not only in imagination, but in graphite lines preserved by chance. The presence of doubt in an artist commissioned to exalt faith is itself a paradox. Michelangelo's ceiling sings of creation, of prophets, of judgment. Yet his hand also traced figures that confessed uncertainty. Perhaps the two are not opposed, but inseparable. Faith without doubt is stone without shadow, fresco without depth. In that sense, the sketches may not defy the church, but reveal the artist's humanity, his struggle to hold vision and obedience in one trembling hand. You feel the air shift, heavier with pigment, as though the scent of plaster dust and oil lingers even now. In the quiet of the archive, the ceiling of the Sistine seems to press overhead, invisible yet immense. The sketches below ground and the fresco above form a dialogue across centuries. The public triumph and the private uncertainty, one painted in light, the other hidden in drawers. A curious letter accompanies the sketches, signed only by Lucia, perhaps a student or correspondent. It speculates that Michelangelo's drawings reflected not rebellion, but fear, that he feared what the church feared, the possibility that truth looked different than doctrine. He drew the spiral, Lucia writes, not to build it, but to remember that another way was possible. He left the eyes empty, because to see it would be unbearable. Whether Lucia was contemporary or later commentator remains debated, but the words cling to the drawings like a shadow that refuses to lift. The echo sentence stirs again. Truth does not fear time. Here it feels heavier, as though even the greatest artist could not escape its weight. His sketches survive not because he displayed them, but because paper endures where secrecy failed. Time has carried them forward, and their whispers now breathe in the same halls as the letters of Galileo and the parchment of Chinon. You imagine standing beneath the real Sistine ceiling after reading these sketches, your eyes lifted to prophets and sibyls, yet your mind haunted by the figure with blank eyes, the spiral where a cross should be. The grandeur above seems both richer and more fragile, knowing the doubt hidden below. The corridor exhales, the frescoed shadows fading. Ahead lies not an artist, but a vow, words spoken in darkness by men in black cassocks. The vow was more than discipline. It was surrender so complete that it compared the body to a corpse. The next chamber holds those chilling words, inscribed not on plaster, but in memory, whispered by generations into silence that even stone cannot forget. The echo of spirals and blank eyes faded, and the archive seemed to slow once more, demanding a pause before the vows of corpses were heard. Here, in this interlude, the stone did not press, but released, as if the walls themselves allowed a sigh. The alcove was dim, lit only by the soft glow of memory. It was a space not for revelation, but for gathering threads, for letting the weight of secrets settle before the next descent. The journey through the archive had by now unfolded into a mosaic of visions. The first vault, with its cold breath rising eternally from the floor. The custodian's mirror that erased his own reflection. The unmarked drawer warning lasciate riposi. Galileo's letter bent between truth and caution. His whispered eper si, mauve floating without proof. The chignon parchment that pardoned knights even as fire consumed them. The ledgers of Templar bankers and the white ribbon of hidden heirs, the black pope in portraits without faces, the cracked seal of suppression, and the rain-stained parchment of restoration. The chalk-dusted classrooms, the unsigned letters of curia influence, the maps of Civitas Solis and Basilicus never built, the sketches of Michelangelo confessing doubt in shadows. Each secret was a door, and each door seemed to open into questions greater than answers. In the pause, these fragments aligned into patterns. The column of cold and the city of the sun both circled eternity in stone. The custodian's mirror and Michelangelo's eyeless figure both erased the self, leaving only shadow. Galileo's softened words mirrored the erased lines of Jesuit documents, truth blurred by trembling hands. The chignon absolution whispered mercy in secret, just as Lucia's letter whispered Michelangelo's fear. Time had not erased these echoes. It had only deepened them, weaving them tighter into the silence of the archive. You sit in imagination on the worn bench of the alcove, the stone cool beneath your hands. The air is heavy with dust, yet it carries a sweetness, like the faint perfume of old paper. Your breath slows, your heart beats softer, until you feel the rhythm of the archive itself. The refrain drifts back. Truth does not fear time. Here, in the interlude, it feels neither command nor warning, but simple fact, as steady as the pulse of your own blood. Some archivists wrote of these pauses. One diary, preserved in faint ink, records the experience of walking the corridors. Every fifth secret, the stones refused me. My key grew heavy, the drawer stiff. Only when I sat and breathed did the lock yield. Skeptics dismiss this as fatigue, but within the archive's atmosphere, such accounts feel plausible, even expected. The labyrinth demands patience, not haste, as though its secrets can only be approached by a heart slow to its rhythm. Dreams often surfaced in these alcoves. A custodian confessed that after guarding the wing of maps, he dreamed nightly of streets curving into circles, of suns that rose without setting. Another, after handling Galileo's softened letter, claimed to dream of his own voice rewritten. His words changed mid-sentence by invisible hands. Were these merely the residue of long hours in dim light, or echoes of the archive itself seeping into sleep? The line between imagination and influence grows thin here, and the pause allows those dreams to linger. You close your eyes in the alcove, and the fragments gather like lanterns, each glowing faintly. The chignon parchment flickers with firelight. Galileo's letter with candle wax. The mirror with a wavering torch. The sketches with graphite dust. They hover in silence, not demanding resolution, but forming constellations of uncertainty. To rest here is to accept that answers may never come, and that the value of these secrets lies not in solving them, but in carrying their weight gently. The archive does not hurry. It has waited centuries. It will wait centuries more. Its breath mingles with yours, slow and steady, until the line between your body and the stones blurs. You sense the pull of the next chamber, but resist, savouring the stillness. The refrain hums again. Truth does not fear time. so soft now it feels like it is spoken not by the walls, but by your own heart. But the stillness cannot last forever. Beyond the alcove lies the 20th century, a time when silence itself became moral burden. There, in drawers heavy with hesitation, rest the letters of a pope torn between revelation and consequence, words written but never sent, truths acknowledged but never spoken. The interlude closes like a sigh, and the corridor beckons you onward into the shadows of war. The air of the archive grew heavier, as though centuries themselves leaned forward to listen. Beyond the alcove of rest lay a chamber less ancient than most, yet no less burdened. Here, the silence did not carry the dust of medieval vaults, but the smoke of a century scorched by war. Within drawers wrapped in grey ribbon rested the papers of Pope Pius XII, a man remembered as both shepherd and shadow, praised by some for prudence, condemned by others for silence. The heart of this chamber was a bundle of letters, drafts never sent, words written in trembling ink, then folded and left unsent. They were attempts at speech that faltered before consequence, confessions that stopped at the edge of proclamation. The parchment is thick, the ink faded to brown, but the hesitation lingers in every line. The truth brings light, one draft reads, but the light also brings fire. Scholars have debated that phrase endlessly, wondering if it reveals fear, caution, or resignation. The drafts remain unsigned, but the handwriting matches other documents of Pius XII, leaving little doubt of authorship. One letter addresses atrocities unfolding across Europe in the early 1940s. It begins with clarity, naming crimes committed against Jews and other persecuted peoples. Yet halfway through, the tone shifts. The words grow vague, generalizing evil without naming its perpetrators. Was this self-censorship? A cautious tempering to avoid direct conflict with Nazi Germany? Or did another hand intervene, softening lines before they could become accusations? The debate persists, unresolved, caught in the fibres of unsent pages. You lean close to the imagined drafts, their folds stiff, their edges yellowed. The ink pools at points where the pen lingered too long, as though the writer hesitated mid-stroke. The words seem to tremble on the page, almost audible in their uncertainty. You hear the scratch of quill, the breath held between sentences, the silence of a man torn between two duties, to truth and to survival of the church he guided. In another draft, the Pope writes of the duty to cry aloud when innocence is crushed beneath tyranny. Yet the letter breaks off abruptly, the final sentence unfinished. A blot of ink marks the page where the pen rested too long. The line trails into nothing, as though speech itself collapsed under its weight. To read it is to feel the ache of silence chosen or imposed. The controversy over Pius XIV has never faded. Some argue his silence saved lives, that by avoiding open condemnation, he kept Catholic institutions functioning, allowing covert aid to the persecuted. Others insist his failure to denounce crimes publicly was a moral failure of the highest order. Within these drawers, the debate crystallizes. The drafts never sent embody both possibilities, courage attempted and withheld. A peculiar object rests beside the letters, a rosary of plain wood, its beads darkened by touch. Archivists note that the cord has frayed, repaired with a knot of rough thread. Was it Pius's own, or left by a secretary? Its presence beside the draft suggests prayer woven with hesitation, faith tangled with doubt. To imagine the Pope holding those beads while drafting words he would never send is to feel the conflict pressed into tangible form. Legends surround these letters. Some say that in private audiences, Pius spoke openly of atrocities, his voice fierce, though never carried into encyclicals. Others claim he feared not only political retaliation, but schism within the Church, that naming crimes too boldly would divide bishops and fracture unity. A few whisper darker tales. That drafts were suppressed not by the Pope himself, but by advisors who feared the Vatican's neutrality would collapse. No drawer reveals certainty, only fragments of intent scattered like ash. You imagine the Vatican during wartime nights. Windows darkened, bells silent, the city under curfew. In papal chambers, candlelight flickers over drafts that lie folded, waiting for a seal that never comes. Outside, trains rumble, carrying their human cargo to silence more absolute. The dissonance between walls of marble and cries beyond them weighs heavily in the air. The refrain returns. Truth does not fear time, yet here it feels wounded, almost bitter. Time has not erased the silence. It has sharpened it. Historians pore over these drafts, publishing volumes of argument, yet the ink itself does not speak. It waits, patient, letting centuries decide whether silence was sin or strategy. You sit with the letters a moment longer, their weight pressing more heavily than gold or relic. In their folds lies not only the fate of a pope, but the measure of conscience under fire. To read them is to face the tension between wisdom and cowardice, between protection and betrayal. And then, as the corridor exhales, the letters fade into their drawer once more. The path bends onward, deeper into shadows where silence becomes absolute. There waits not a pope, but a phantom, a brother who copied manuscripts and then vanished from history, leaving behind only a sheet of red ink that declared truth too heavy for all to bear. The chamber of unsent letters gives way to the chamber of erasure. The air beyond the letters of Pius XIV grew colder, though no column of stone exhaled here. Instead, the silence pressed in, as though every sound had been stripped away. This was the chamber of erasure, the place where names dissolved from parchment and faces faded into rumour. The drawer that held it bore no label, only a plain wooden front scarred by scratches too faint to be read. Within, archivists found files half empty, pages that began but did not end, reports that trailed into whiteness. Among them lingered the ghost of Montessier and the shadow of Brother Avellino. The name Montessier appears in a handful of records, usually linked to inquiries about clerical misconduct in the 17th century. Yet when archivists sought the full dossier, they found only blank pages, entire folders filled with silence. The first sheet bears a heading, Investigatio Montessi, but beneath, nothing. No testimony, no verdict, no conclusion. Some speculate the case was deliberately destroyed. Others argue it was never completed, abandoned before ink touched parchment. Yet the drawer where it rests is too deliberate for chance. It feels less like absence than removal, as though something heavy was lifted away, and its weight still lingers. Even stranger is the file of Brother Avellino. He appears in references as a scribe assigned to copy manuscripts in the late 16th century. Marginal notes in other texts bear his name, his hand steady and precise. Then, suddenly, he vanishes. No death record, no reassignment, no mention beyond the faintest traces. It is as if he dissolved into the archive itself. One page remains, written in red ink. Veritas est pondus quod non omnes fer possunt. Truth is a burden not all can carry. The letters bleed across the fibres, as though the ink refused to dry. You lean close to the imagined page. The red strokes seem to shimmer even in shadow, sharp against the yellowed parchment. The handwriting is steady, almost elegant, yet the choice of red ink unsettles, as though each word was drawn from a wound. Archivists debate whether this was his final note, a warning before disappearance, or a forgery left by others to explain his absence. No conclusion satisfies. The page feels alive, whispering in silence that truth, once written, demands a cost. legends grew quickly. Some claimed Montesi was not a name, but a code, an acronym hiding a larger secret. Others suggested Brother Avellino uncovered something in the manuscripts, an apocryphal gospel, a heretical account of Christ's life, a doctrine too dangerous to survive. And for that, his name was erased. A few whispered that he himself never existed, that Avellino was a ghost invented to explain red ink warnings scattered in drawers. The archive does not confirm or deny. It only preserves the page, its words sharper than absence. Imagine walking the corridor where such blanks are stored. The drawers open to reveal silence, their emptiness more haunting than full pages. The absence becomes presence, louder than ink, like a bell that tolls without sound. You touch the white sheets, and they seem to pulse faintly, as though erased words still breathe beneath the surface. In dreams, some archivists swore they saw letters reappear in faint grey, only to vanish when candles were lit. Whether trick of vision or echo of memory, the effect remains unsettling. What makes these blanks so powerful is their ambiguity. Were they erased by design, purged to protect? Or did they never exist, leaving only rumour to fill the gap? The mind resists voids. It invents stories to cover them. Thus, Montesi and Avellino live on, not in fact, but in imagination stronger than fact. Their silence is more fertile than testimony. One peculiar annotation, written centuries later, describes the ghost scribe who continued to work after erasure. A custodian claimed he found a manuscript whose margins bore Avellino's hand, dated decades after his disappearance. The ink matched his style, the letters his unmistakable rhythm. Yet the date was impossible. The custodian swore the page was genuine, though no one else ever saw it. The manuscript has since vanished into misfiled drawers. Fact or fable, the ghost scribe became another layer of the story. A man erased from records who continued to write in secret. You feel the weight of absence pressing heavier than presence. The blank pages draw the eye more fiercely than words could. As if silence itself demanded attention, the red ink of Avellino's final note glows like an ember in the dark, refusing to fade even as centuries pass. Truth is a burden not all can carry. The phrase lingers, settling into memory like a warning whispered in dream. The refrain returns. Truth does not fear time. But here it trembles, challenged by silence. Time has not revealed Montesi, has not restored Avellino. It has only deepened their absence, made their erasure thicker. Yet even so, their names echo still. Proof that silence itself cannot erase completely. The corridor breathes again, as though weary of ghosts. Ahead lies not erasure, but conclusion, the final steps of the labyrinth. The archive prepares to close its drawers, its secrets folded once more. Yet, before rest, one more chamber awaits, a gathering of shadows into a single hush, where truth, legend, and silence blur into a wind-down that lulls as much as it unsettles. The archives seem to exhale as the ghost of Brother Avellino faded back into silence. The drawers, which for so long had offered fragments of parchment and whispers of secrets, now stood closed, their brass handles dull with age. What remained was not revelation, but accumulation, a weight of stories pressing against the mind like stones stacked into a wall. The penultimate chamber was not filled with new discoveries, but with reflection, a chance to trace the path through shadows before stepping into the final hush. 19 doors had been opened, each revealing a piece of the labyrinth. The first vault exhaled its column of cold air, spine of stone-breathing questions. The custodian's mirror erased the face of any who dared stand before it. The drawer with no name whispered "Lascia che riposi," its warning heavier than ink. Galileo's softened letter trembled between truth and compromise, while his whispered "Eppur si" Mauve carried defiance without proof. The chignon parchment pardoned knights, even as fire consumed them, its contradiction bleeding into history. Templar ledgers clinked with phantom coins, their network of wealth haunting centuries, while whispers of Merovingian heirs suggested bloodlines hidden under cloaks of secrecy. The Jesuit general emerged as Il Papa Oscuro, portraits blurred and vows sharpened into corpse-like obedience. Suppression shattered them in 1773. Restoration drenched their parchment in storm-stained ink. Classrooms hummed with chalk and discipline, their influence stretching across empires. Unsigned letters in the Curia hinted at guidance too subtle to prove, erasures leaving only silence behind. Then came maps of cities unbuilt, circles of sun and basilicas, of spirals, dreams remembered rather than realized. Michelangelo's sketches revealed doubt beneath triumph, eyes blank, spirals drawn, whispers scribbled, non sono solo. The oath of corpses echoed still, surrender deeper than obedience. The letters of Pius XII trembled in unsent drafts, truth caught between duty and fear. Finally, the emptiness of Montisi and the red ink of Avellino declared that silence itself could be a burden too heavy to bear. Each fragment stood alone, yet in this chamber they aligned. Together they wove a pattern of contradiction, truth written and erased, mercy whispered and denied, obedience exalted and feared. The archive preserved not certainty but tension, not answers but questions heavy enough to survive centuries. To walk its corridors was to learn that silence is as enduring as speech, absence as powerful as presence. You sit again on the stone bench of imagination, the same alcove where earlier pauses gathered threads. But now the weight is fuller. The whispers of 19 chambers crowd the silence, not clamouring, but humming together like a choir of ghosts. Their voices do not sing harmony, but dissonance, yet the effect is strangely calming. Perhaps it is because dissonance feels truer than resolution, more faithful to the contradictions of human history. The refrain returns once more. Truth does not fear time. Spoken here, it feels final, as though the phrase has travelled the length of the labyrinth and now rests. Yet its meaning has changed at every stage. At first, it was courage. Later, fatigue. In Michelangelo's sketches, it was confession. In Avellino's red ink, it was burden. Now, at the edge of the labyrinth, it feels like surrender, the acceptance that truth need not triumph to endure. A custodian's journal preserved in this wing tells of his final walk before leaving service. "The drawers will not close," he wrote. "They sigh when I press them shut, as though reluctant to sleep. Yet I know they will rest, and in resting, they will last longer than I." His words echo the mood of the chamber itself, that endings are not conclusions, only pauses before centuries turn the key again. You lean back, close your eyes, and let the stories drift. Galileo's trembling quill, the Templars' whispered curse, the Jesuit vow, the spiral basilica, the red ink bleeding across parchment. They swirl together, dissolving into a haze of images. The distinctions blur, as though the archive itself insists that fact, legend, and silence are threads of the same cloth. Legends say that in this chamber, the stones themselves grow warm, as if storing the weight of every secret before release. Some guards claim to hear faint bells here, not from towers above, but from within the walls, a sound soft enough to lull even the most restless visitor. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps the archive offered its own benediction, a sound to carry listeners toward rest. The path forward is clear now. Only one chamber remains. The final section, where shadows slow into stillness, where the motif of steel and bells and mist closes its circle. Ahead waits the wind down, the gentle return to silence, where history itself exhales and the archive releases its burden into night. The final chamber of the archive was not a room at all, but a vast hush, as though every drawer, every parchment, every whisper had drawn a last breath and exhaled together. The corridor opened into stillness, and the stones themselves seemed softer, their weight gentler. No portraits hung here, no maps or letters weighted in sleeves. What remained was silence, an ending that was not an end, but a winding down, a release. The motif of steel and bells and mist lingered faintly, as if the journey through knights and popes and whispers had distilled into atmosphere. You could almost hear the echo of armor striking stone, not in battle, but in slow procession. Bells tolled somewhere distant, not sharp, but muffled. Each chime dissolving into mist that curled like breath across a forest floor. The corridor no longer felt underground, but beneath trees. The archive fading into landscape. Memory returning to earth. All that had been gathered. Galileo's softened letter. The Templars' absolution hidden in parchment. The Jesuits' vow of corpse-like obedience. Michelangelo's blank-eyed sketches. The Pope's unsent drafts. Avellino's red ink now lay folded together, indistinguishable. The details blurred, yet their weight endured. They did not demand resolution. They asked only to be remembered as fragments, proof that history is stitched not by certainty, but by silence and survival. You sit in imagination upon the final bench, though here it feels less stone than wood, as though placed beneath an open sky. The air smells of pine and iron, the faint tang of distant rain. Shadows fall not from torchlight, but from clouds drifting across a pale moon. Time feels slowed, stretched, as if each breath lingers a little longer before releasing. The refrain that has carried you through the labyrinth returns. Truth does not fear time. This time it is not whispered by stone or echo, but by your own breath, unforced, natural, fading into the air around you. The archive, after all its corridors and vaults, reveals itself not as a prison of secrets, but as a mirror of memory itself. Truth is softened, erased, whispered, doubted, yet still it endures. Even when hidden in blank pages or folded into silence, it survives in the act of wondering, in the questions carried forward. Perhaps that is why Father Angelo's words still linger. The Church buries questions, not the dead. Perhaps questions are what keep history alive, pulsing like embers in the dark. You lean back and let the images dissolve. The cold vault's invisible breath, the mirror without reflection, the drawer with its warning, the city of the sun never built, the spiral basilica, the red ink bleeding across parchment. They drift like leaves on mist, circling slowly before sinking into stillness. No detail remains sharp. Instead, they merge into a quiet chorus that hums softly in the bones. Legends say that those who reach the final chamber often fall asleep, lulled by the weight of silence. Guards reported finding scholars slumped over desks, quills fallen from their hands, as if the archive itself insisted on closing their eyes. It is easy to believe. The rhythm here is steady, the air thick but gentle, each heartbeat slower than the last. You imagine the knights, the popes, the scribes, the artists, all those whose names filled the labyrinth, standing together in mist, their voices subdued. None speak loudly. None argue. They wait in patience, like bells after their final toll, like steel cooling after battle. Even their secrets rest now, folded into the night. The motif closes, steel dulls into silence, bells fade into echoes, mist settles over the forest floor. The archive sleeps, and with it, the questions. Yet they do not vanish. They wait, as all truths wait, patient across centuries. And so the story winds down, each sentence lengthening, slowing, until words themselves feel like breaths. The corridor grows fainter, the mist heavier, until only stillness remains. The secrets of the archive are not solved, but set aside, wrapped in shadows, guarded by time. May the weight of those whispers rest lightly upon you. May the bells of memory ring softly, not to wake, but to lull. And may the mist close gently, carrying you not into answers, but into sleep.